Welcome to the DX Today podcast, your daily deep dive into the AI ecosystem. I'm Chris, and joining me as always is Laura. And Laura, today we are heading to the Midwest because Illinois just decided it is completely done waiting for Washington to regulate artificial intelligence.
That's exactly right, Chris, and this is one of the most consequential AI policy stories of the year. On Monday, July 6th of 2026, Governor JB Pritzker stood in Chicago and signed Senate Bill 315, the Artificial Intelligence Safety Measures Act, into law.
I want to set the stakes right up front, because a single state passing a technology law might sound like a local story. But you have been telling me all week that this one is genuinely different from the usual statehouse noise.
It really is different, and here's the headline reason why. Illinois did not write this law in a vacuum. It deliberately mirrors California's Frontier AI Safety Law and New York's RAISE Act, both signed in late 2025. So 3 states are now rowing in the same direction on purpose.
Okay, so walk me through the raw numbers behind that coordination, because that seems to be the part that transforms this from an interesting regional experiment into something every frontier AI lab in the country genuinely has to care about.
Together, Illinois, California, and New York hold roughly 20% of the American population. But lawmakers estimate those 3 states represent roughly 40% of the entire United States AI market. When you regulate 40% of a market with aligned rules, you have effectively created a de facto national standard.
That is a striking framing, because Congress has been debating federal AI legislation for what feels like forever and has passed essentially nothing comprehensive. So the states are quietly assembling their own national framework, one governor's signature at a time.
And Pritzker was not subtle about that at the ceremony. He said, quoting here, "Congress and the president ought to be passing similar legislation, but they've so far been unwilling because many are captive to special interests that profit from the industry having no regulation." And he closed with, "Illinois has chosen our path."
Wow, that is remarkably pointed language for a bill signing. Before we go deeper into the politics, though, let's do the substance. Who exactly does this law apply to? Because I assume it is not going after every startup with a fine-tuned chatbot.
Correct, the thresholds are deliberately narrow. The law targets only the largest developers, meaning companies generating more than $500 million in annual revenue whose models are trained using massive computing power. So think OpenAI, Anthropic, Google DeepMind, Meta, xAI, that tier of frontier lab, not your local AI startup.
Got it. So this is aimed squarely at the frontier. Now, give me the core obligations, because saying a law increases transparency and accountability is easy, but the actual mechanics are where these things either work or fall apart completely.
There are 4 big pillars. First, covered developers must publish a safety framework explaining how they identify and assess catastrophic risk. Second, they must report critical safety incidents to the state. Third, confidential whistleblower channels and protections for employees. And fourth, the one making headlines, mandatory annual independent third-party audits.
Let's take those one at a time, starting with catastrophic risk, because that phrase gets thrown around constantly in AI safety debates, and it usually means whatever the speaker wants it to mean. How does Illinois actually define it in the statute?
The statute defines catastrophic risk as the likelihood of incidents that could cause death or serious injury to more than 50 people, or more than $1 million in property damage. So think a model helping someone build a chemical, biological, or nuclear weapon, or enabling a major cyber attack on infrastructure.
That is a much more concrete definition than I expected, honestly. In the incident reporting piece, what does that timeline look like in practice when something actually goes wrong inside one of these labs and they have reason to believe there's a problem?
Developers get 72 hours to report a critical safety incident once they have sufficient reason to believe one occurred. But here's the kicker. If the incident poses an imminent risk of death or serious physical injury, that window collapses to just 24 hours. That is an aggressive disclosure clock.
72 hours is basically the same window that data breach laws use in Europe. So there's precedent for companies operating on that kind of clock. Now tell me about the audits, because you said that provision is the first of its kind anywhere in the country.
This is my favorite detail of the whole story. New York's RAISE Act required a single independent audit. One time when a developer first became large enough to qualify. Illinois requires an independent third-party audit every single year, forever. No other state and no federal law has ever mandated recurring outside audits of frontier AI safety practices.
So an outside firm comes in annually and checks whether the lab is actually doing what its published safety framework says it does, which sounds an awful lot like how financial auditing works for public companies. Is that the right mental model here?
That is exactly the right mental model, and it is why policy people are calling this the beginning of an assurance ecosystem for AI. Before financial audits became routine, companies could publish whatever numbers they wanted. Illinois is betting that verified safety claims will eventually be as normal as verified financial statements.
Now let me push back a little because I can already hear the counterargument from industry. Who exactly is qualified to audit a frontier AI lab? There is no accepted set of AI safety accounting principles, no certification body, none of the infrastructure financial auditors rely on.
That is precisely the objection industry raised during the debate. TechNet, the coalition of technology executives, argued Illinois would effectively require private actors to make highly subjective determinations about AI safety compliance without established national standards, certifications, or clear regulatory guardrails. Their representative made that case in committee back in May.
That does not seem like a crazy concern to me, honestly. If the auditor's job is subjective, you could end up with a race to the bottom where labs shop for the friendliest auditor, the way some companies once shopped for credit ratings before the financial crisis.
It's a fair worry, and even supporters admit the audit regime is a first draft of something bigger. But here's the counterpoint. The penalties give it teeth. Violations bring civil penalties from the Attorney General of up to $1 million for a first offense and up to $3 million for each one after that.
Although, playing devil's advocate again, for companies whose revenue threshold for even being covered is $500 million a year, a $1 million penalty is a rounding error. Does anyone seriously believe that fine schedule changes behavior at OpenAI or Google scale?
The fine itself is not really the deterrent, Chris. The deterrent is discovery, disclosure, and reputation. Once the Attorney General opens an enforcement action, everything becomes public record. No frontier lab wants to be the company caught skipping its own safety framework while telling enterprise customers and regulators it was being careful.
That is a good point. The reputational overhang probably matters more than the check they would write. Now, here's what genuinely surprised me in the coverage. OpenAI and Anthropic actually supported this bill. The companies being regulated showed up in favor of the regulation. What is going on there?
It surprised a lot of people. Anthropic even had representatives physically present at the signing ceremony on Monday. Part of it is that both companies helped shape the aligned bills in California and New York already. So consistency across states is genuinely valuable to them. A coordinated 3-state framework beats 50 contradictory ones.
Right, the thing the labs feared most was never really regulation itself. It was the patchwork, 50 different states with 50 incompatible definitions of catastrophic risk and 50 different reporting clocks. Aligned frameworks in the 3 biggest AI states basically solved that problem for them.
Exactly. And OpenAI said that part out loud. Their global affairs representative told an Illinois Senate committee in April that while OpenAI believes the federal government is best positioned to lead on frontier safety, the company sees a real role for Illinois, California, and New York in advancing aligned frameworks that create a de facto national direction of travel.
I want to come back to the politics of the vote itself, because in 2026, almost nothing passes any legislature with genuine bipartisan support. And you told me before the show that the margins on this bill were honestly kind of shocking.
They really were. The bill passed the Illinois House unanimously. Not a single no vote from either party. And in the Senate, only 5 Republican senators voted against it. For a law regulating the most contentious technology industry in America, that is about as close to political consensus as this country gets right now.
What explains that consensus? Because regulation debates at the federal level have been bitterly partisan, with one side warning about existential risk and the other warning that any regulation hands the future to China. Why did that fight not happen in Springfield?
2 reasons, I think. First, the sponsors grounded the bill in concrete harms rather than science fiction. The House sponsor, Representative Daniel Didek, said during debate, "We have already seen the first AI-inspired mass shooting, and we have already seen AI systems utilized to attack a municipal water and drainage utility. Those are not hypotheticals to voters anymore."
And I'd note for our listeners that this spring, one of the frontier labs itself validated those concerns in a pretty dramatic way, which the sponsors leaned on heavily during the floor debate, as evidence that even the companies think these capabilities are getting dangerous.
Yes, Didek directly referenced Anthropic's Mythos model, the one Anthropic itself described as too powerful a cyber weapon to release to the general public earlier this year. When the company building the technology publicly says a version of its own product is too dangerous to ship, legislators across the spectrum pay attention.
What was the second reason for the consensus? You said there were two, and I suspect the second one has more to do with ordinary politics than with any deep philosophical agreement between the two parties about artificial intelligence risk.
The second reason is that the law was scoped tightly enough that nobody's local constituency got hurt. Small businesses are exempt, startups are exempt, universities are exempt. The only entities regulated are a handful of giant out-of-state corporations. Voting for guardrails on billionaire coastal AI labs is easy politics in both parties.
That scoping raises my next devil's advocate question, though. If the threshold is $500 million in revenue, what about a smaller lab that builds something genuinely dangerous? Capability and revenue are not the same thing, and open weight models keep getting more powerful at lower cost every quarter.
That is probably the sharpest criticism of this whole legislative generation, and safety advocates openly agree. Scott Weiser, the policy director at Secure AI who helped shape the bill, points out another gap too. The audit checks whether you complied with your own framework, not whether your model is actually safe to have in the world.
Say more about that distinction because it is subtle but really important. A company could write a weak framework, follow it perfectly, pass its annual audit with flying colors, and still ship something that causes exactly the kind of catastrophic harm this law is supposed to prevent.
Precisely. Weiser's example is basically that. Your framework says we will do steps A, B, C, and D. You do them, the evaluator confirms it, and the model can still be a risky thing to have out in the world. His view is that external evaluation of the models themselves is the necessary next step.
So the honest way to describe this law is process regulation rather than outcome regulation. It forces transparency and verification of process, but it does not yet let anyone outside the company independently test whether the model itself crosses a danger threshold before release.
That's the accurate framing, and the sponsors seem to agree this is a foundation rather than a finish line. DIDEC has already identified medical care and education as the next frontiers needing evaluation of AI public safety risks, so expect follow-up legislation in Springfield over the next couple of sessions.
There is one more caveat I want to flag before we zoom out, which is the timeline. This law does not take effect until January 1st of 2028, which in AI terms is roughly 4 model generations from now. Is that delay a problem?
It's a real tension. 18 months is an eternity in this industry. The charitable read is that the delay gives labs time to stand up compliance programs and gives the audit ecosystem time to actually exist. The uncharitable read is that the urgent risks the sponsors cited get a grace period until 2028.
Let's zoom out to the national picture now, because Illinois is clearly not happening in isolation. What does the broader state legislative landscape look like right now, in the middle of 2026, while Congress continues to do essentially nothing on frontier AI safety?
It is an absolute explosion of activity. 78 chatbot safety bills are alive in 27 states this session. Rhode Island just enacted a therapy chatbot ban in June. New York's synthetic performer disclosure law took effect this month. And California alone has roughly 30 AI bills still moving, covering everything from workplace surveillance to companion chatbots for kids.
So the states are dividing up the problem, with the big 3 handling frontier safety as a block, while others go after specific consumer harms. But here's my honest question. Industry keeps pushing Congress for federal preemption, one national law wiping out state AI rules. Does this block survive if Washington ever wakes up?
That is the trillion-dollar question. But notice the game theory has flipped. Every additional state that aligns with the framework makes preemption politically harder, because you would be repealing protections that passed with near unanimous bipartisan votes. Even Ohio has resolutions urging Congress to reject any moratorium on state AI laws.
So the states are essentially building a regulatory fait accompli. By the time Congress can agree on anything, the de facto standard will already be operating, the audit firms will already exist, and the labs will already be complying. Rewinding all of that becomes nearly impossible.
And there's a corporate reality that makes it even stickier. No frontier lab is going to build separate safety practices for Illinois versus everywhere else. They will comply with the strictest common denominator across the 3 states and apply it globally, which means Illinois just set the safety floor for every AI user in America.
That is the classic emissions playbook, where the biggest regulated market quietly sets the national product standard because building two versions costs more than meeting the tougher rule everywhere. And before we land this, I hear the Senate sponsor delivered the single best line of the entire debate.
Oh, she absolutely did. Senator Mary Edley Allen told the chamber, "Teach a man to fish and he eats for a lifetime. Teach AI to fish, though, and it might just empty the whole river trying to figure out how." That is the best one-sentence summary of alignment risk I have ever heard from a legislator.
That is genuinely funny, and it captures the actual technical concern better than most white papers do, which is that optimization without guardrails pursues goals in ways nobody intended. So let's land this. What should our listeners take away from Illinois this week?
3 things. First, the center of gravity for American AI regulation has moved to the states, with an aligned standard covering 40% of the market. Second, annual independent audits are the start of a real assurance industry. And third, watch the gap between process compliance and actual model safety, because that is where the next fight happens.
And my takeaway for anyone building in this space is simpler. The era of frontier AI as an unregulated frontier is visibly closing, not through one dramatic federal law, but through a steady accumulation of state signatures, and the smart labs have clearly decided that shaping these rules beats fighting them.
Beautifully said, Chris, and we will keep tracking this story as the audit requirements take shape. As more states consider joining the aligned framework, and as Springfield turns its attention to AI in medicine and education next session, it is going to be a fascinating couple of years in state houses.
That's all for today's episode of the DX Today podcast. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.